It is my special pleasure to invite you today to a conversation between two scholars, and all of this goes under the title, The Second Robbery, Aryanization and Restitution of Jewish Property in Austria. And this is based on the work of the presenter, Rachel Blumenthal, who is one of our current Gerald Westheimer Development Fellowships. Rachel Blumenthal is a trained lawyer. She's also a historian and comes to us from Israel. This is a work that requires sort of deep insight, and so from her different fields of study, she's bringing this to us. And let me just tell you a few of her previous accomplishments. So the right to reparations, the Claims Conference, and Holocaust Survivors is her most recent book. First book. And she has been focusing in her work on the history of Austria and restitution, post-war and before. The person that she is going to talk to, the commentator and respondent, is Elizabeth Anthony, who comes to us from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, where she is the director of visiting scholar programs. And she also has worked on the topic in a related fashion. And her book, The Compromise of Return, Viennese Jews After the Holocaust, sort of focuses right into this conversation. Maybe this presentation will be a little unusual in that Rachel will go through her topic by way of a PowerPoint presentation, and Betsy will respond to that as we go. So it is a discourse, discussion, dialogic form. And then afterwards, we will have questions from you. For those who are on the internet, please put your questions in the Q&A. And we will have somebody here who will monitor this, and then the questions will go to the speakers. So I give the floor to you.
Okay, this is working. Well, thank you so much to Leo Baeck Institute for inviting me to come and to moderate this discussion with Rachel. It's a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you.
And it's a pleasure to work with Leo Baeck Institute, and it's a pleasure to work with you, Rachel. As Frank said in his kind introduction, my work has taken into account a lot of the kinds of things that Rachel is a real expert on and focuses in on. And so it makes sense that we're here together today. So we worked together to sort of structure a conversation. And Rachel has some really wonderful visuals. I think maybe to get us started, I'd like to ask about your motivations and your interests. How did you get started working on this topic?
Okay, so Hello to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for coming in person and online. That's clear. And thank you very much to the Leo Baeck Institute for funding my research. Thank you to Frank Mecklenburg, and a special thanks to Betsy. We met in London in December, and it's a great pleasure and an honor that you have agreed to conduct this dialogue with me. So when I made the transition and how they failed in Germany in the 1960s, recently I've been looking at these refugees in post-war Austria, very inspiring, brilliant people. And my dissertation was on the Claims Conference. And in the course of my research, I discovered an organization about which I'd never heard, an organization with a very long name, because all Jewish institutions have very long names. It's called the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, and it's known by its Yiddish acronym IRSO. And this organization was headed by the late Ben Ferenc. He was a lawyer, and he got together a group of lawyers, and they ran around occupied Germany in the western zones, and they went to the land registry offices and they searched for property that had been owned by the Jews before 1933. They filed claims and they claimed, and often usually got, restitution. And I was interested in understanding whether there was any similar activity in Austria, whether there was an IRSO in Austria, and if not, why not? Onto a more personal level, on the left, that's my grandmother, that's Wilma Lichtenstern. You're living next to people who you don't know what they did during the war. How could you go back? And I asked people, I even asked Hannah Lessing, and no one had a very good answer. So this is why I decided to do my research.
Great, thank you. It sounds familiar, although it's not a part of my family history. That too, being in Vienna and seeing people there who had come back, obviously. That's right. Just made me start asking questions, and so I understand completely. So, I know that in your work, you talk about 3 stages of plunder. And would you tell us about that? And also, you've said that in Austria they went to work perfecting the plunder of Jewish property. Maybe you could explain more about that.
Okay, so thank you very much. Austria was very different from Germany, both in the violence that erupted immediately after the Anschluss and in the speed at which things occurred. And so I divide the plunder into 3 separate stages, although in practice, some of them happened concurrently. And the first stage began when the Wehrmacht crossed over the border into Austria on the 12th of March 1938. And this was basically looting. And another example is of someone who wrote a book about his, it's a semi-biographical book, he's called Wolfgang Georg Fischer, and he talks about how a Nazi came into his apartment, looked, he was a banker who had funded Hitler early on, so what happened was that you filled out your form, and then you received a summons to go to this office. You had to bring with you all your property, all your movable property, your furs, your jewels, your paintings, and then it was processed by the office. The gentleman on the right is a lawyer called Walter Kastner, and he was responsible for expropriating 102 big Jewish businesses. And I want to show you now by the type of property what happened.
So now let's turn to the post-war and restitution. And this was very complicated when restitution legislation went into place, and in Austria it somehow effectively slowed down the process, if not ended it in many ways. So maybe you can tell us more about the legal framework for restitution and the significance of the 3rd restitution law, and also that I know it's true that there was coverage for actually compensating the so-called Aryanizers who were losing property wasn't there.
Okay, so thank you very much. So Betsy in her book, she describes about what actually happened, which is how people went back and they tried to go back to their apartments. And if someone else occupied their apartment, they just moved into an apartment on a different floor. But I want to talk about the legal framework. So the legal framework was established, the legal principle that was established by the Allies in 1943 in what's called the London Declaration. And according to this principle, all plunder of Jewish property was void. So what happened, what was different from Germany and Austria was that in Germany you have Jewish property all over Germany, and a lot of it is in the western zones where the US military are very helpful with restitution, whereas in Austria 90% of the Jews lived in Vienna, so I guess 90% of the property was in Vienna, and the Soviet presence, I mean, it's true that Vienna was divided up into 4 zones, but initially the Soviets ruled it by themselves, and the Soviets had undue influence on what happened in Austria, and so they prevented, they didn't prevent, but they didn't enable restitution, and you had a government, you had a functioning government, federal government, that's enacting these laws way before Germany has a federal government.
I would add to that, just along to what you're saying, that the Soviets in the beginning they just weren't doing anything about it. So people did, like you said, I've written about, people just went back to their apartments, and if they were empty, if the Nazi who had taken it had fled the Soviets, they'd just move back in, or maybe the Nazi was still there, but they would move in downstairs. And so people in the very beginning, when they first came back, did get things back, and then once, even before the restitution laws kicked in, but once the other allies joined them and started getting involved, then things started getting taken back away.
That's right.
And so it was, the Soviets just weren't doing anything about it, and then once the rest of the allies got there, it started falling apart.
I just like a clarification. You used the word Aryanizers got this, and Aryanizers were paid, and so on. Could you clarify who were these Aryanizers that you referred to throughout your talk?
Okay, so I apologize. I should have made it clearer. Aryan is the term that the Nazis used for anyone who had no Jewish blood, and when they talk about Aryanization, the idea is plunder by non-Jews. And it's either plunder by individuals, by neighbors, by partners, or by the state. It's and the people at the end, the Aryan owner, or they are the people actually in possession, but they are usually former Nazi members or former partners, not Jews.
And they were paid. They got the benefits of the money that was.
No, they were there once. They ended up with the property.
Oh, okay.
And they, in theory, should have, and some of them they actually paid for the property, but the money, which was much less than the actual value, went into an account, and the Jewish owner received nothing because they weren't allowed, and then that went off into banks, into the Dresdner Bank and the Deutsche Bank, and that was the end of that money. So.
At the beginning, you showed this slide with the process of the Aryanization, and with the paintings, it says that they were auctioned by the Leopold Museum. But the Leopold Museum was founded in 1995 and opened its doors in the year 2000. So my question is, can you explain the source you used that made you say this?
No, you're right. So I saw that paintings were auctioned. I saw somewhere about the Leopold, but you're right. It was probably later. You're right.
No, it was not at all.
It was not a.
No.
No, but you're okay. Okay, I'm corrected.
So perhaps just a couple of questions from online, and then we'll have time for some more from the room. So first, more of a compliment than a question from Jennifer Malvin. Thank you so much. Yours was the most clear and articulate lecture on Aryanization and compensation I've had the opportunity to listen to. Here's another question from Elizabeth Freshow. Hi, Elizabeth. I'm glad you're with us today. She asks, did your grandmother ever talk about her feelings about Vienna? My mother, who had to flee, wanted to return. She loved Vienna, not the people so much, but the city, and read Vienna. I know how this exists and continues into my own generation. And Elizabeth, of course, is the author of a book of poetry called They Clasp My Hand, which is published in English and German by the Theodor Kramer Verlag, and it deals with this sort of intergenerational aspect of Austrian heritage, Austrian Jewish heritage, rather.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. My grandparents, so my grandmother, not only she went back in 1947, but they went back, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, they went back in the summer to Bad Gastein, where they met all their friends who were all over the world. My grandfather, who had been a lawyer, and he'd been the company secretary of a department store, Gerald, which is on the first slide, he never went back. He never forgave, and his life was, you know, he instead of being successful, professional in a place that he loved, he ended up in London. He was incarcerated as an enemy alien, and he wanted to have nothing to do with Austria after they successfully managed to escape.
Thank you. Can you please say something also about the 65,000 Jews that were murdered and the monument that was created a year and a half ago? Obviously, they might have had property, they might have had descendants, or whatever. I mean, they were the ones who lost not only property, but also their lives. What were the discussions in post-war Austria about restitution or Wiedergutmachung vis-à-vis the murdered Jews of Austria?
So it's important to remember, and I should, but clearly losing property is nothing compared to losing your life. And I have relatives who were sent to the east, and a lot of them were elderly, because usually everyone understood, as soon as the Anschluss happened, everyone understood that there was no future in Austria. Again, this is different from Germany, where people thought, because it was so gradual, people thought it can't get any worse. Whereas in Austria, it was clear that you had to leave, and not everyone was able to leave. And so usually it was the elderly people who were left behind, but there were other people. There was my hero is Ruth Kluge, who her mother and she remained behind, and some of them ended up, like my relative, in Lodz, in the ghetto, and I don't know what happened, but he probably starved to death. And Ruth Kluge and her mother ended up in Auschwitz, where they were lucky and they survived. But a lot of people didn't survive. Betty knows more than me, but people ended up in Theresienstadt, and people ended up in all the different camps in Eastern Europe. And I don't know of the Austrian government. So the Austrian government, much later, after the Waldheim affair, did provide some sort of compensation, but and there was compensation if you were incarcerated according to the laws immediately enacted immediately after the end of the war. But I think very few people got any compensation for people who had been murdered in the Holocaust, for the 60,000 Jews. The 60,000 Jews and 65,000 Jews, I think it covers, there were, I don't know, some of them included people who were unlucky and had escaped, like Anne Frank's family had escaped from Germany to Holland and were caught there. some of these Viennese people had escaped to France, to other countries, and were caught there. There was no justice for them.
First of all, Deborah Dwork says wonderful presentation, thank you. But we have two questions about any sort of more recent efforts to address the inadequacy of this earlier restitution. One listener asks whether the claims conference has any official agreements with Austria now, or has made any headway in getting additional restitution. And then Astrid also asks, are there any efforts by the Austrians today to compensate for the inadequacy of restitution processes in the past?
Okay, so there's someone here who knows much more about the claims conference than me. Starting after the Westheimer affair, there were, and my talk is only about the decades, the first 2-3 decades after the war. Starting from 1995, the Austrian government did try to reach some sort of settlement. There were different rounds of negotiations, and there was some sort of compensation. They set up a fund. There were 20,000 people's claims were recognized, but because again they limited the sum, people got very small amounts of their claims. If it was insurance, you got 20%. If it was bank accounts or other claims, you got 10%. And I saw they also agreed to reopen cases of restitution of real estate of businesses. And I've read a number of cases where basically the claimants got nowhere. They said, people made huge profits out of these businesses. And so a claimant would say, I received the property back, but I sold it for a very small sum, and then someone sold it for 10 times, 100 times the sum, and I should be compensated for that. And the Restitution Compensation Commission, and we're talking now about in the 2000s, said, that's your fault, you should have done better due diligence, and we're not going to cover those losses. And so there was compensation, but it was again very limited.